We know from in the last 24 hours that Israel controls water, controls energy, power going in there. Many would see that that is a control that Israel shouldn't have if you want to afford equal rights to people living in Gaza. And then it comes down to proportionate response and how you try and, like I say, how do you attack Hamas, given they're all over Gaza, living amongst the general population? How do you attack and isolate genuine members of Hamas, genuine terrorists, from the civilian population? And given that is almost impossible, clearly, what is a proportionate response to what's happened here?
Well, frankly, I don't believe in proportionate response to terrorism. I believe that the way that you stop terrorism is with wildly disproportionate response. That doesn't mean in terms of targeting civilians. It means in terms of killing as many terrorists as humanly possible and allowing them to dictate the terms of engagement by hiding behind civilians in areas that they are supposedly responsible for, means that the only option for Israel is to surrender to Hamas's hatred of its own citizens, its willingness to use its own children as human shields. No country worth its salt could ever do that. No government trying to protect its own citizens could ever do that. What exactly is the alternative option other than for Israel to try to kill as many of these terrorists into post-Hamas and hopefully help put in place some sort of international overseen community that would actually govern the Gaza Strip in a rational, reasonable way that actually maximizes the possibilities of its citizens? Israel, over the course of the last year, allowed some 15,000 work permits to Gazans. Many of those work permits, we're now finding out, were used by terrorists in order to cross the border. The fact that Israel controls the water and the power, the reason that Israel controls the water and the power is specifically because if they did not control the water and the power, Hamas would be right now holed up with the water and the power indefinitely. I mean, the fact is that the reason that Israel controls, for example, the sea border is because if they did not, there were attempts to ship weapons in from Turkey multiple times. The impossible situation in which Israel finds itself with regard to the Gaza Strip is mirrored only by the impossible situation in which Gazan civilians find themselves. And all of that, every single iota of that, is the result of Hamas, which means unless there is a change in status, in which Hamas is removed from power, in which someone else is put in charge, this is going to continue. Again,
but I would
Israel,
argue,
10,000 Jews want to die going into the Gaza Strip in order to defend their citizens?
I agree with you, but I would also say that I think that it would also benefit any chance of a peace settlement that if Netanyahu wasn't in charge anymore. I mean, apart from anything else, this is an unbelievable breach and failure of security and military. I think part of that can be apportioned to the extraordinary social unrest that's been enveloping Israel since his cabinet, full of a lot of right-wing headbangers, frankly, some of whom have actually called themselves fascists, have tried to take on the judiciary and the Supreme Court. I don't feel comfortable about that. What do you feel about that? And do you feel that Netanyahu is the right person? Does it need a completely clean leadership now, both in Palestine and Israel, to try and get to somewhere approaching peace?
The democratically elected government of Israel has not had a change in policy, despite the fact that until very recently, Netanyahu was not the prime minister of Israel. It was a joint government run by Naftali Bennett, as well as by Yair Lapid, who's a member of the hard left who dramatically opposes Benjamin Netanyahu. Today, they formed a unity government between Benny Gantz, who's a member of the center left, and Benjamin Netanyahu, who's a member of the center right, Likud party in Israel. This is not, when it comes to foreign policy, the reality is that since the rejection of any peace deal by Mahmoud Abbas in 2009, when Ehud Olmert was the prime minister of Israel, there's been very little disagreement between any of the parties with regard to foreign policy because they do not have a peace partner. The Oslo process was killed by the Palestinians, and it was killed by the Palestinians when they rejected multiple peace offerings by Ehud Barak, by Ariel Sharon, by Ehud Olmert, over and over and over again, by Yitzhak Rabin, by Shimon Peres. Benjamin Netanyahu himself, in the Wye River Accords of 1998, handed over significant portions of the West Bank to the Palestinians. So you can say that Netanyahu's a problem. That's fine. But the reality
I was
is
really
that
asking you whether I was asking you whether you feel he is a problem, that actually all the division that's been caused by his attempt to usurp the power of the Supreme Court, as many people see it, all that division in Israel has actually diminished his authority. And that it's come at a time when you really need somebody with real authority.
Well, I mean, I don't think that right now that's really the question, considering, again, it's a unity government, and I'm talking to everybody in Israel, and all of those divisions heal up in a moment when your children are being slaughtered at the border, as it turns out. So, all of the judicial reform conversation is a separate conversation. We can critique how fast they went in terms of this coalition. They went too fast. They scaled it back. There were serious divisions in Israeli society about what kind of power the judiciary ought to have. There are many people on both sides, actually, who believe the judiciary had too much power. There are a lot of people on both sides who believe the government went too fast on that. Internal political divisions have become completely irrelevant here. If Netanyahu were replaced tomorrow by Benny Gantz, which is what a lot of Israelis would hope for, if that were to happen literally tomorrow, nothing would change. Nothing would change. And the reason nothing would change is because, again, this is an issue, this particular issue is about Hamas. This has nothing to do with the constituency of the Israeli government. You could find the most left-wing person in Israeli politics right now, which would be Yair Lapid. You could put him back in the prime minister seat, and he would be forced with exactly the same decisions that Netanyahu is faced with right now.
How do you see, take me forward 20 years. In a dream scenario, how does the region look?
In a dream scenario, economic development, which I think is what the Abraham Accords were about and what the burgeoning Saudi peace deal was about. And by the way, the burgeoning Saudi peace deal is the reason that Hamas did this at the behest of Iran. They were afraid of a regional realignment that would create a Sunni-Jewish alliance,
right,
oriented largely against the Shia power of Iran, which is spread through Lebanon, Syria, and now down into Hamasistan. The economic development is the only way to move forward for the region. That was the premise of the Abraham Accords. Again, it was the premise of the nascent Saudi peace deal. Israel would love to do that with the Palestinian Authority. They would love to do that with anyone governing the Palestinians to provide better economic conditions. I mean, one of the great ironies of all this is that 20% of Israel's population is Arab. The Arabs in Israel earn a far better income. They have far better GDP per capita than Arabs who are living under the Palestinian Authority or under the Gaza or under Hamas. And when you take polls of Israeli Arabs, many of whom are not particularly fond of the state of Israel, almost zero of them wish to actually relocate to any of these areas because economic development is economic development. The way out of this is that, but in order for that to happen, the people on the other side of the table have to actually agree that economic development is a worthwhile thing, is an end goal. And this goes back to the original point that I was making, is that we in the West, we believe that economic development worthwhile, that what we are all seeking is the same sort of peaceful, decent life where we leave each other alone and get to live our lives. I think that we all agree on that. But there's a group of people who absolutely do not agree with that, and they don't care about the level of economic development. They would rather live. I mean, Hamas would rather that its own citizens live in poverty and penury and orient themselves against the extermination of the Jews than that economic development even be allowed to take place. I mean, I know everyone in the Israeli government, I promise you, everyone in the Israeli government, right to left, would love nothing better than economic development of the people surrounding them so they don't have to send their sons and daughters to go fight and die in Gaza.
Do you believe in the concept of a two-state solution?
I mean, if there were a party on the other side to negotiate with, and if the possibility of a two-state solution was real, sure. I mean, but the question is, how realistic is that? Negotiations cannot be the cure-all. You have to have a partner on the other side of the table. The entire premise of the Oslo Accords is that you could take an actual terrorist by the name of Yasser Arafat. You could negotiate with him. You could make a deal with him, and this would magically cure the situation. Well, a deal is not capable of being cut with literally anyone. That's not the way any of this works. So in order for there to be any sort of long-term peace, including a Palestinian state, there would have to be a complete difference in leadership in these areas. And that would actually require Palestinian moderates to take the floor. The Palestinian Authority is not a moderate group. Islamic Jihad is a terrorist group. Hamas is a terrorist group. And until that changes, nothing's going to change. And by the way, there is the possibility of that change. If you had told me 10 years ago that there would be Saudi-Israeli normalization on the table, I would have laughed in your face. If you told me that Israel would have been able to cut peace deals with the UAE and with Morocco, I would have scoffed. And I think everyone would have scoffed. So there is that possibility. But again, you cannot make peace with a side that wants to murder you. That is not a possibility.
Well, on that point, all I would say to that is I'm an Irish Catholic, and we had the Troubles in Northern Ireland. Different circumstances. I'm not going to try and equate the two. But there you had people on both sides trying to kill each other. You had the IRA trying to kill civilians indiscriminately to make their political points. And in the end, a peace deal was achieved, but it was achieved by people sitting down opposite people they knew had been killing civilians and killing people on their side. You even had the Queen meeting Martin McGuinness and Gerry Adams, who were in McGuinness's case, the former chief of staff of the IRA. He ordered some of the most appalling atrocities. The Queen, one of her own relatives, was blown to pieces, Lord Mountbatten, by the IRA, but she still met with them. I was actually at number 10 Downing Street when Tony Blair met McGuinness and Adams on the steps for the first time in 70 years as the members of Sinn Féin, and shook their hands. I was next in to see him in his office, and it was an extraordinary moment to watch. And it was a moment many people thought would never happen. Do you see any parallel there in terms of what could be achieved with Israel and Palestine?
Only if the leadership changes. Only if the leadership changes on the Palestinian side. That is the only way that happens. And again, the difference here is that the IRA had territorial ambitions. Hamas does not have territorial ambitions. They have genocidal ambitions. The Palestinian Authority has been offered multiple deals over multiple decades, and they have rejected, without counteroffers, virtually every deal they have ever been offered. Islamic Jihad is a terrorist group. Again, if the IRA was dedicated to the complete slaughter and eradication of every non-Irish Britisher in the UK, that would be the equivalent of Hamas. And that would not be a negotiating position because, again, could there be successful negotiations? It depends on the partner.
Right.
I mean, the example that you're using is the best example of sides that are incredibly far apart coming together. But here we are talking about one side that, simple premise, if Israel put down all of its guns tomorrow, every Jew in the region would be slaughtered. If Hamas put down all of its guns tomorrow, Israel would leave the Gaza Strip alone. It is that simple.
Let me ask you got into a Twitter spat with Andrew Tate yesterday. He's a converted Muslim. He'd been doing a lot of supportive tweets for the Palestinians. And he tweeted at you at one stage, "Mr. Tough Guy, let me assure you as someone who's done his own fighting as opposed to excitedly encouraging others to do it for him while sitting at home on a comfy chair, peace is always worth a conversation." What was that spat about? Why did you engage with him? What do you feel about that?
Well, what I feel about that is that he was tweeting that immediately, like as terrorists were still running around in southern Israel. That was on October 10th. And he was still tweeting while the bodies were fresh and warm in the streets. Peace is, you cannot make peace with people who murdered your children and burned their bodies. You can't do that. I mean, this rush to Israel, the murder happens and you immediately say, okay, well, guys, now truce, now ceasefire. That is not, no state worth its salt, no government on earth would allow this kind of insanity. No government on earth. And no government on earth would listen to nonsense about how you immediately have to seek peace with a group that seeks your direct extermination. Again, I can't emphasize enough. Israel turned over the Gaza Strip to Gazans in 2005. Hamas has governed the area since 2006. The year is currently 2023. Israel has endured round after round of rocket fire on its major cities for literally almost 20 years. And now the idea is the minute that Gazan terrorists rush through the border and murder people in their beds, that's the time for a peace conversation? That's the time for a peace conversation? By the way, and I'm not going to be lectured on morality and toughness by Andrew Tate, whose great idea of toughness and morality is pimping women and then bragging about it on air and trying to quasi-walk it back while simultaneously maintaining many of the same positions and flexing his biceps.
I mean, he's got a huge following, as you know, especially online. Is it dangerous? Is it reckless that he's able to tweet from house arrest still, of course, in Romania, that he can tweet on something like this and have the kind of influence that he has?
Listen, everyone should be able to tweet whatever it is that they want. I'm all for an open discourse, even with people who I think are dead wrong on a lot of these issues. But Andrew Tate is dead wrong on a lot of these issues. And the particularly ridiculous posturing about being you're very tough when you want people to make peace with terrorists who just murdered their children. Very, very tough.
You mentioned Iran earlier. President Biden yesterday came out, 10-minute speech, sounded very tough and very supportive of Israel, but never once mentioned Iran. Was that a failure by him, or are they waiting to establish concrete evidence of Iran's involvement?
So I think there's a good reason he could have done that and a bad reason that he could have done that. And the bad reason is pretty obvious, which is that the United States has unfrozen $6 billion in assets to flood into Iran in return for hostages. That money is fungible, and there's every possibility that money flowing into Iran since the weakening of sanctions has contributed to Iran's spread of terror. That is not only a possibility, that's a probability, and everyone knows it. So if you avoid mentioning Iran, then presumably it avoids blowback. That is the bad reason. The good reason might be that the United States wants to take down the temperature in the region. So right now, geopolitically, this is a contained conflict. This is Israel versus Hamas in the Gaza Strip, and everyone of good heart on every side should hope that it remains that way. If Hezbollah, which is on Israel's northern border and is an Iranian client, Hezbollah is a massive and significantly more powerful than Hamas terrorist group that exists and has say in the government of Lebanon. Again, Israel is surrounded on a lot of sides by terrorist groups that masquerade as government. Hezbollah has about 150,000 much more sophisticated rockets than Hamas pointed at northern Israel. Everyone understands that if Hezbollah, which would only do this at the behest of Iran, if Hezbollah were to get in, Israel would then be stretched militarily to the point where they would not have any choice but to go full force. And what that means is that all of the talk right now about the supposed disproportionate force that Israel is using in the Gaza Strip, talk with which I wildly disagree, that will all go out the window, because once you are stretched to the point of extermination, all bets are off, and the Israeli Air Force will have to be unleashed on the southern border of Lebanon. At that point, you would have to imagine that Bashar Assad in Syria starts to get active, Iran starts to get active. So one of the things that the possible good reason why he didn't mention Iran is because he's attempting to keep Iran out of the war. That basically the idea would be, he did say in the speech that any other group that wants to get in, don't. America, to its great credit, to our great credit, we've stationed a battle carrier, an aircraft carrier outside of Lebanon in the Mediterranean, and basically said to Hezbollah that they should not get in. That is, in fact, the best available move. So again, there's a very plausible bad reason why he didn't mention Iran, which is to avoid the blowback from his own idiotic Iran policy. And there's a possible good reason, which is that he's attempting to avoid the broadening of the conflict.
Donald Trump says, as he's wont to do with these crises, that it would never have happened if he was president. Do you think that may have some truth?
I think there's some truth to that, for sure. I think that Iran has seen weakness. Iran saw an opportunity to prevent the Saudis from coming into the Abraham Accords, and they thought that they could push where they saw mush. I mean, the withdrawal from Afghanistan made America look weak. The continuous dealings between the United States and Iran, despite Iran's openly genocidal intentions with regard to Israel, has made America look weak. The fact that Robert Malley, who is one of the chief negotiators for the United States, was apparently co-opted by Iranian intelligence groups, makes the Americans look particularly weak. And so appearances of weakness in the Middle East matter an awful lot. It is not politics in Western states, where we try to negotiate, we try to have discussions. That is not how politics works in the Middle East. It is a place where strength is really the only point of the realm.
There is a theory that Hamas have done this spectacularly awful act of terrorism deliberately on a scale that would goad Israel into overreacting and spark a much wider war.
I mean, I think that there's probably truth to that. I think that Hamas, I think that's what Iran wants. I'm not sure that Hamas wanted that. I think Hamas doesn't want to be wiped off the earth, which they probably will be and ought to be. But I think that Iran's hope was that Israel would have to go in incredibly strong into the Gaza Strip, and this would provide internal pressure in Saudi Arabia to prevent them from forming an alliance brokered by the Americans with the Israelis. I think that was probably the geopolitical reason for that. With that said, that does not mean that Israel has any other choice. Again, if suddenly 1,500 terrorists flooded into Great Britain and proceeded to murder 15 to 20,000 people, because again, Israel's a tiny, tiny country, it has 9 million people. If those numbers were made proportionate, if tens of thousands of people were slaughtered in Britain by a group of terrorists, I doubt that there'd be a lot of British citizens who are sitting around worrying about proportionality or worrying about the geopolitical consequences of protecting their own citizenry.
There is an interesting contradiction, I would argue, that a lot of conservatives in America, a lot of Republicans, have, including a number of presidential candidates from Ron DeSantis to Trump and others, they have signaled that they would want to severely curtail, if not stop altogether, support for Ukraine. And yet Ukraine was invaded by Russia. A lot of people slaughtered, continue to be slaughtered. Is there not a contradiction there, that these Republicans would be full square behind Israel when it happens to them, but not full square behind Ukraine?
I mean, yes, there's a contradiction. It depends on sort of what is being said about Ukraine, and it runs the gamut. Some of the candidates that you've talked about have talked about ending aid completely to Ukraine. Some have talked about continuing aid to Ukraine and pursuing some sort of deal with the Russians that allows them to keep part of the Donbass and Crimea, which I think is a completely different story and is an actual off-ramp. But yes, anybody who is sympathetic to Russia in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and then is sympathetic to Israel in this current conflict, that is a bizarre position to take. And again, I think that they're serious. America's a sovereign country. It has its own concerns that are not Israel's concerns, and it has its own concerns that are not Ukraine's concerns, and those don't always line up. But when it comes to a possible contradiction between a completely isolationist position on Ukraine and an interventionist position or a supportive position on Israel, of course, those things could clearly be in conflict. In my own position, by the way, for what it's worth, since as you know, Piers, I do this for a living, my own position on Ukraine has been that the United States should continue to supply Ukraine with the support necessary in order to preserve its government and to preserve its territory. And meanwhile, there need to be serious talks about what exactly an off-ramp looks like in Ukraine, because virtually no one has spelled out exactly what that looks like. And virtually no one believes at this point that Ukraine is going to be able to completely take back both the Donbass and the Crimea region. That is not
it's very complicated. Having been to Ukraine and interviewed President Zelensky and met a lot of people there, and that was quite a while ago, there was an unbelievably steely resolve, and I would say the same resolve that Israel has about ceding any land now to the Palestinians. It's like they just don't want to give an inch of land away to the Russians. That was to a man and woman that I met out there.
I have an enormous amount of sympathy for that position. Again, that position does not necessarily dictate American policy any more than Israel's position with regard to, say, the so-called occupied territories, disputed territories, should necessarily dictate America's position on that. There are realistic consequences and concerns to be had on foreign policy. But if the point that you're making is that lack of moral support in an invasion of a sovereign country by Russia is in contradiction with moral support for Israel in this, I would say, yeah, I mean, there's certainly inconsistency there.
I mean, the other inconsistency and contradiction, it seems to me, is the reaction of the world when George Floyd was murdered, which was a despicable killing. And the police officer concerned is now serving a life sentence, quite rightly. But that sparked enormous global protests over America, over the UK, everywhere, with people marching in protest at what they perceived to be a racist murder of one person. And yet the reaction within hours of what happened here, where, as we knew at the time, nearly 1,000 people in Israel had been murdered, some in the most utterly horrific circumstances. The reaction was that, yes, there were big protests again, but they weren't really protests, they were marches of celebration. In America, in the UK, they marched down my local high street, celebrating what had happened, pro-Palestinian marches. I found that extraordinary.
Jew hatred is a very real thing. It's a very real thing. And we've obscured it with a lot of talk about Zionism and anti-Zionism, and we've obscured it with a lot of talk about geopolitics and context. But in the end, Jew hatred is quite real. And when you see crowds in Sydney chanting, "Gas the Jews," not free the occupied territories, not make a peace deal, gas the Jews, I'm not sure what we're supposed to read into that other than people mean what they say when they say gas the Jews.
Yeah, I mean, and that's exactly what they mean. I mean, this is Nazi language. I mean, but as you say, the difference between this and the Nazis tried to keep the secret, whereas this is all in plain sight. I mean, the idea of people doing this in cities like Sydney and London and New York, it's actually terrifying. And I say that again, I'm an Irish Catholic, I'm not Jewish. I feel terrified for Jewish people. Like you say, there's only 15 million Jewish people in the world. It must be, when this kind of thing happens in such an indiscriminate manner, it must be genuinely terrifying for people.
For sure. And obviously when you see marches of support, the question is always asked, how could the Holocaust have happened? And the answer is this way, when people are actively in favor of Jews being murdered simply for being Jews. And again, it's easy. People have an amazing ability to justify whatever it is that they're thinking or feeling at a given time. But if you can find a way to justify yourself out of the murder of babies in their cribs, I have a hard time figuring that it's anything other than Jew hatred. And so if, as a Jew, as a person who, is very strongly Jewish, I'm very active in my Jewish community, I'm a person with 4 kids and a wife and parents and sisters and all of this, obviously Jews feel like they are at risk everywhere because of this sort of activity. And I will say there's an amazing double standard when it comes to anti-Semitism and its treatment in the media. The way that it seems to work in the media these days is if somebody politically says something about George Soros, then they will be labeled a Nazi. And if somebody actually says I am a Nazi, then they will say, well, there's probably some sort of justification over territorial disputes.
Yeah. I want to end, Ben, on one positive note, and it's a montage we have of support for the Jewish people and for Israel. Let's take a look. So Ben, that last image was of the Brandenburg Gate, which of course we saw back in the 30s with Nazi swastikas all over it. And today the Israel flag is emblazoned across it proudly and supportively. I mean, amid all the Jew hating, and you're right, that's what it is, there's also been an amazing outpouring of support.
And that is incredible. And we who are Jews obviously appreciate that. And I would just like to say at the very end here that that must be translated into allowing Israel to do what must be done to protect her own citizenry, because goodwill only goes so far as the actual protection of human lives. And if the Jews were to rely on the goodwill of the world over the course of history, it would have gone very poorly for them. That's why the state of Israel exists. It exists so that never again is never again. And in order for that to be a reality, the IDF, the state of Israel, has to be able to defend itself, has to be able to defend its citizenry and protect them from the kind of slaughter and savagery that we saw over the weekend.
Ben Shapiro, thank you very much indeed for your time today. I appreciate it.
Thank you.